Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Canadian Love. Now today we've got a First Nations woman who's also two-spirited named Hollee who's going to come and tell us about her life, experiences, and views on politics. I personally, as a white Canadian from suburbia, am really excited to hear about her experience and how different it is what she's lived. Now, as always, if you've lived a similar experience, maybe there's some things you can relate to. If you want to come on the show and tell us about your side of the story, we'd love to have you. And if this experience, like me, is vastly different from yours, get ready for a great ride. Let's talk politics, Canada. Hollee, hello. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Michael. I am going to be asking you some questions in a toga, if that's all right.
That's okay.
Okay, good. So Hollee, welcome to Canadian Love. As I've explained to you a little bit, this is a show about just helping every Canadian understand every Canadian's political experience and perspective and where it comes from. I mean, we have a lot of super diverse people in this country who sometimes really vehemently disagree with each other. And I really believe, and my team really believes, that the more we can try to understand people who we would traditionally disagree with and not talk to and avoid if we see them walking down the street, if only they had signs saying what they believed, I think the more that people can connect about this and understand and talk to people who they disagree with, the more we can craft a vision that will actually make Canada a better place, and the more we can engage people in politics. So thank you very much for coming and being part of this process. So a quick rundown of how we're going to do this. We're going to start it with just a quick sort of, a quick qualification of where you are at politically. So how you would describe yourself politically, and then we'll just blast through a couple of hot topics and get a quick read on your opinion. I might ask you a couple questions to tease out what you feel about things, but we're not going to go too far into why. Then we're going to talk about your lived experience, who you are, what you've lived through, and then we're going to bring the two together to figure out why you believe what you believe, where it comes from, and just really help someone who hasn't lived your experience, aka everyone else, understand, where you're coming from and why you believe what you believe. So that's the idea. So my first question for you, Hollee, is how would you describe yourself as a Canadian in politics?
I'm not Canadian.
You're not Canadian, okay? Bold starting statement, not Canadian. Continue.
I'm an Anishinaabe, which means I'm an Indigenous two-spirit woman.
Okay.
A First Nations first person of this territory.
Yeah, that's huge and really cool. So, yeah, right out of the gate, that's very, very, very interesting. So
I never identify as a Canadian.
Really?
Never.
Okay. And would you say that a lot of, and I'm sorry, tell me how to pronounce that?
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe.
Mm-hmm. Meaning that I'm an Ojibwe two-spirit person, an Indigenous woman of Canada.
Yeah. Okay, so an Indigenous woman of Canada, but not a Canadian.
Well, I will use that statement so other people can understand. Okay. But you asked me to qualify myself, and very often I identify as an Anishinaabe, which means basically an original person to these lands.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Sort of similar to the idea of First Nations.
Exactly.
Here first.
First Nations, yes.
Yeah, okay. Sidebar, as an ignorant white person, should I say Anishinaabe? Should I say First Nations? What's the best way for me to refer to this?
I would say Indigenous.
Yeah.
Because identity is so very personal. It's often, I think, appropriate to ask somebody how does an Indigenous person, how they identify. Some may identify as Native, Aboriginal, Métis. Some may identify as Indigenous. I prefer to identify in my language. Anishinaabe, which is the use of the Ojibwe language. And that qualifies me, I guess, as the first people of these lands.
Yeah. So for someone who doesn't speak Ojibwe, they should just say Indigenous.
Indigenous.
Okay.
Yes.
Noted.
To be PC.
Yeah, well, that's fair. I mean, I don't want to offend you. You don't want to be offended by me.
But we often use those many terms interchangeably, depending, of course, on who the audience is, what it is that we're talking about. So,
yeah,
there's a number of different things that Indigenous people use those words interchangeably. It's
Yeah.
hard to explain.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Thank you for trying. So it sounds like it's sort of a ask who you're talking to, no hard and fast rule. If in doubt, just go with Indigenous kind of a, yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Had I just met you on the street, I would identify myself as an Indigenous woman of Canada. But when I'm introducing myself more formally,
Yeah.
and for this purpose, I certainly don't identify as Canadian. I identify as Anishinaabe.
Wow. So politically speaking, you would not identify as Canadian because you are part of your own political system and jurisdiction, right?
Well, I don't, of course, historically, we didn't have the boundaries
Yeah.
of Canada, US, provinces, territories. We didn't have those boundaries. And so, in acknowledging and being a first person to Turtle Island, being all of North America, I'm acknowledging that we didn't have those boundaries and I belong to all of
Turtle Island.
Turtle Island.
Yeah. Is it okay for white people to say Turtle Island about North America? Because I really like that, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say this.
Well, you should educate yourself on what that is.
Okay.
Obviously, Turtle
Fair.
Island, very simply, is North America.
Yeah.
And we have creation stories related to how that came to be. But I would certainly educate yourself on why it is that we've come to know it as Turtle Island instead of North America.
Okay. Oh, that's fair. So I shouldn't just say it without educating myself first. I should educate myself first and then maybe say it. Okay, well that makes sense. So Hollee, I mean, this is really, really interesting for me. How do you feel about Canadian politics then, and Canada as a political system? I mean, you're sort of, and just logistical question, forgive me. Do Indigenous people vote in Canadian elections?
Yes.
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 Okay. Which is interesting because I hear you guys don't receive a lot of the social services and infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, we do have a voting population, both on and off reserve.
Yeah.
Municipal election, you'll find us voting in municipal elections,
Yeah.
regional, provincial, federal elections. Yeah, we
All
definitely
levels.
have a vote. And it's important. As an Indigenous person, I want to say that it is important to vote and be involved in that process because we weren't allowed to vote for a very long time.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah,
It was illegal.
Wow. When I mean, this is a history lesson that I can research, but just quickly, like, when was that something that became like how long have Indigenous people been able to vote in Canada?
Since the 1960s.
1960s. Okay.
So particularly as an Indigenous person, but also as a woman, voting is very, that was not afforded to us.
Yeah. As an Indigenous woman, voting for you is, God, yeah, you guys have fought hard. Wow. Okay.
Very important.
Clearly, yeah. That's really wild. That makes me take voting for granted slightly less as well. So, so politically speaking, you're a part of all of the Canadian systems, municipal, provincial, and federal. And then are there also separate political systems by reserve, by overall tribe? Is there an Ojibwe leader for all of the Ojibwe? How does that work?
Well, certainly I'm involved in the regular Canadian political system as a voter.
Yeah.
But there are on-reserve politics as well. So my home First Nation community is governed by an elected chief and council.
Yeah.
And it is up to the band membership to elect them into those positions of leadership. I do participate in that election process as well. Even though I don't reside on the reserve, we still have voting capacity on reserve matters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that makes perfect sense. That's very cool. Okay, so that's a lot of political systems to participate in. That's pretty cool. So for Canadian politics, you have a very unique perspective here, one that I personally do not have. Are you okay with me blasting into some of our hot topics and just seeing how you feel about them?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So environmental issues. Priority, not a priority? Any thoughts about Canada on environmental issues?
It should be a very high priority.
Yeah.
And I think if the Canadian population would listen to Indigenous people and really know and understand what it is that we're talking about in terms of preservation, conservation, about having the earth is our mother, that she provides all life, she provides all things for us to be well and to be balanced. And as we continue to rape the land and use it for profit, in traditional Indigenous teachings, customs, and practices, when we utilize the land, we only utilize the land for what it is that we need to sustain ourselves. And certainly we've not seen that. And as an Indigenous people, I think what Canadians need to know and understand is the relationship that we have with our Mother Earth is beyond physical. There's a physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual connection that we have to the land. And to take that from us is so damaging.
Yeah.
So damaging in so many ways. But also, when you see in media the Indigenous people across this nation speaking for the land and standing up against deforestation, like you'd mentioned earlier,
large corporations,
pipelines and all these kinds of things, we're not just doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for settlers, colonizers, allies, friends, the people that all are here in Canada. And we're not just doing it for ourselves. We're not just doing it for the here and now. We're doing it for generations, because we do have a teaching that says, and I can just simplify this, is that what we do now has an impact 7 generations ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I did a degree in environmental studies, and there were things where literally a factory that was built and a regulation that was sort of a corner was cut 30 years ago, and then children are dying of cancer like 2 generations down the line because of the bioaccumulation of toxins. So that makes a lot of sense to me. When you say the spiritual connection to the land being taken away from us, is that an us as in First Nations people specifically? Is that an us as in like urban Canadians who have lost touch with nature? Is that both?
It's probably both.
Probably both,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, probably both. But from an Indigenous perspective, to be able to have those spaces, to be out on the land, it is a process of connecting physically, mentally, and spiritually, emotionally. And it really provides, and there's the difference here. We have such a relationship with the land. We're not just there taking up space. We genuinely have a relationship and a connection with the land, and to not honor that is so damaging, and it's damaging in so many ways. What it does is, when we don't have access to lands, we don't have access to water, to land, to these animals that we need culturally, I guess.
Sure.
I'm trying to explain it in the best way that I can, is that it creates an unwellness. It creates an imbalance in ourselves, in our families, in our community, in our nation.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I know that a lot of people I associate with are dealing with things like anxiety and depression, and I know that for myself, this is purely anecdotal evidence, no science involved in this, but I know that for myself, when things are really getting me down and I spend time outside sort of experiencing nature, I feel a lot better. I don't know if that's...
Yeah. And that's very, very true of Indigenous people, is that is, we go to our mother when we want care and nurturing. We go to those people who can provide those, that care and that nurturing, that love, that acceptance, that unconditional love and acceptance. And that is kind of the way that we see the earth as our mother. We go to her for wellness. We go to her for balance. We go to her for advice, care, nurturing, wellness. Yeah. And so to disconnect us, to dispossess us from our mother is extremely harmful.
That makes sense, yeah. So in terms of the Canadian political system, so, I mean, I definitely understand the opinion that the Canadian government is somewhat short-sighted with regards to focusing on profit and development instead of how our children's children will be affected by their connection to the land and what has happened to the land. I definitely understand that. Is there anything that comes to your mind in terms of, what would, like if we were going to fix the situation for all of Canadians and their connection with the environment, or with the Canadian government and prioritizing a more long-term relationship with the land that is literally Canada. Is there anything that comes to mind on that? Like what needs to be implemented here to fix this? Is it enough if we just start
Indigenous people
encouraging?
need to take the lead on
Okay.
being stewards of the land, because it's something that, again, beyond the relationship with the land, it's something that the land is something that we know and understand beyond, I think, colonial understanding. Again, that spiritual relationship. We know we've had that relationship for time immemorial, and to be able to have the First Nations people take the lead on the preservation of the lands across the nation, I think would be an important step.
Okay, that's a really cool idea. Now, speaking of that, Indigenous people and the Government of Canada. What are your thoughts on the Government of Canada and how it deals with Indigenous people and Indigenous rights?
That is a hot topic for sure.
Yeah, it is.
Certainly, we're in the era of truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
I often go back to, I had the honor and privilege of going to see Senator Murray Sinclair, in which time he said that truth and reconciliation is 4 A's. It's awareness, acknowledgement, adjustment, and action. And I can see where there has been some movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yet then it's like we go a few steps forward, then 10 times back. I don't see that reconciliation is going to true reconciliation is going to happen anytime soon. But I think there are people that are genuinely making efforts. The Canadian government, definitely not. Definitely not.
Woof. Wow. Okay. So the Canadian government is not making genuine reconciliation efforts. Why not? What are they missing, aside from sincerity?
Well, I think they fail to recognize that Indigenous people are sovereign people, and that we're a nation of our own, and that this big brother, great white hope attitude, through their policies and legislation, in particular the Indian Act, their forced way of governing us, and not really listening to what it is. Like before settlers got where we had a way of governing ourselves, and we did so effectively and successfully. To have an attitude that you come sweeping in here and not giving an open mind and an open heart to the fact that we know how to do things we know how to take care of the land, we know how to take care of ourselves and our family and our community and our nation. So to sweep in with a colonial legislation and policies that continue to be oppressive and continue not to acknowledge that we know what it is that we're doing and what we're talking about, is it doesn't work.
Can you tell me a bit more about how it's oppressive?
Well, the Indian Act is a particular piece of legislation that we're heavily governed by.
Yeah.
So I would encourage it. It is a nasty, hateful piece of legislation. In the eyes of the government, I am simply a number. I'm a registered status Indian, and I'm simply a number. I'm stats and revenue. And, there's, for a long time, there was things, and it's very complex, but I would encourage everybody to read it. There are very many things in history that we were not allowed to do. We weren't allowed to come and go on the Indian reserves as we saw fit. We needed permission from Indian agents to move about in our own territories. Certainly, Indian residential school is a topic that's hot across Canada right now, as are Indian day schools. Yeah. The Indian Act certainly is a process of legislated assimilation and genocide, I feel. It is designed to breed Indians out of existence.
How so? Mm-hmm. That is a bold statement.
Well, it's the truth.
Yeah,
it's
fair,
the truth.
I want to hear more about this.
The way that the way that we're registered under the Indian Act, where we qualify based on blood, who it is that we marry, when we were married. There's been changes to the Indian Act, but still, There was a period of time where Indian women who married non-Indian men had lost their status. That has changed. They're able to gain their status back. There was a time pre-1985 where non-Indian women who married Indian men gained Indian status and federal registration. So,
so it was very misogynist in its approach, very male oriented.
right. And so, there's been some changes. Those Indian women who have lost their Indian status have now regained that, but there's a whole lot of mess still to be cleaned up because of the Indian Act. But what it didn't do, and this is something that's coming up in many times that I've seen, is that for those women that gained their Indian status back, that's great and that's wonderful. But what they didn't do is they didn't revoke the status of non-Indian women who gained that status. So they, through the changes, they gave Indian women back their status, but they didn't revoke the status that was gained by non-Indian women. So there are very many non-Indigenous people, blood, I'm talking, that are card-carrying status Indians and band members to particular First Nations, but yet they don't have Indigenous blood.
Interesting. I mean, I guess that one, it feels like that's sort of a product of a society that at the time was very much about, all women are the property of a husband who basically buys them through marriage, and then they become part of whatever their husband is. And you feel this is also done to, you said, to breed out Indigenous people?
Yes, absolutely. The way that piece of legislation is structured, depending on, because we do know in today's day and age, there's a lot of intermarriage.
Of course.
There's all kinds of people, marrying and having kids from different nations, and that's okay. But the Indian Act is designed to only qualify or legitimize people as Indigenous people based on that piece of legislation. But it's like, as soon as you hit this point, it's like you no longer qualify to be Indigenous.
Wow, yeah. I mean, that is problematic, telling somebody that they are no longer who they are. Like, oh, did you do that? Did you marry that white dude? Okay, well, you're no longer who you are anymore. I can see how that's problematic. Now, being a status Indian, comes with things that I've heard people say are benefits and that they're jealous of, and as opposed to, the lived experience of being an Indigenous person in Canada. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, like the difference between, oh, well, they don't have to pay taxes and they can gamble, versus the actual lived experience, what you get from being a status Indian versus what it actually means to be a Canadian Indigenous person, or an Indigenous person of Canada.
Right. Well, being a status Indian, I mean, certainly there's benefits to it, and those are rights-based benefits. It's so some people think that status Indians, they get free housing, free education, free this, free that, that we don't have to pay taxes, and that's certainly not the truth. Yes, if for status Indians, there is particular funding available to status Indian people who want to carry on into post-secondary school. There are housing options available on reserve. Some off reserve as well. To say that we don't pay taxes is certainly not the truth. I was a homeowner. I paid property taxes just the same as anybody else. I pay the taxes, when I do point of sale purchases. There are occasions where I will use my status Indian card to make a purchase that would be tax exempt. For instance, PST and GST exempt. I know that we have the HST, but we're exempt from part of that tax. We can be entirely non-taxable depending on the circumstance. For instance, I'll give you an example. if I purchase a new vehicle. Well, obviously it's a high ticket item, right? So
Yeah.
it's big money.
Yeah.
And so I want to save on the taxes. So I'm going to use my tax exempt card to save on those taxes, but it needs to be delivered to an Indian reserve.
Oh, really?
For me to be wholly non-taxable.
Okay.
Income taxes is another thing. I live in the city of Kitchener. I work in the city as a professional. My income is taxed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Just like everybody else.
Yeah.
However, for those status Indians who are working on the reserve, their income is non-taxable.
Right. Okay. That's fair.
Yeah. So to say that we, the tax thing is, and I'm just sharing my lived experience. I know that when I'm working on the reserve, my income for this period of time is non-taxable. If I'm working off the reserve, then it is taxable.
Yeah.
And this goes back to, like, we have so many systems and so many rules that we live with every single day.
Right.
That I think Canadians need to really educate themselves on. It can be complex, but I've been living with it for 42 years. So
right. You personally are used
I'm used to it.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I want to get a little bit more into, your lived experience, but first I'm just going to throw you a couple of topics. Or just continue doing these topics. So as a two-spirited Indigenous woman, where does that put you on issues like feminism, trans people using bathrooms, consent being taught in schools, that sort of gamut of issues?
Well, as a two-spirit person, and for those who have not ever heard that term, that means I'm a lesbian. I belong to the LGBTQ2S community. But from an Indigenous perspective, a two-spirit person is somebody who is gifted, somebody who has been gifted with wider perspective, being able to see the male perspective, female perspective, to be able to be fluid between genders, and to be a helper, to be a healer, to be mediator. Traditionally, the two-spirit people are well respected and very revered, and very much a part of the circle of family and community and part of our nation. And the two-spirit people, I think, have now come to a place where they're coming back into those circles of family and community, into the nation, and taking, a place where they had been originally a sacred place, as a person of leadership and a person of vision for the family and the community and the nation. In terms of educating people on LGBTQ issues, absolutely. From an Indigenous perspective, we were here. We were always in our families and always in our communities. So why don't we teach that? And why don't we? It's not something that we choose. For us, from an Indigenous perspective, it's a gift from the Creator to be able to be fluid between genders.
I have to say that's a pretty cool way of thinking about it, that two-spirited people are able to sort of see both sides of the gender perspective. It's sort of see the male side, see the female side, and that gives them a unique perspective for leadership, to be able to see both sides and mediate between them. That's very neat.
And two-spirit people will often step into gender roles, particularly in traditional ceremonies, if there are I'm trying to explain it very simply. So if there was a task that was usually to be done by men, and maybe there wasn't enough men, or men just aren't available, then it would be the responsibility of the two-spirit people to step in and provide that. And what I've heard from the elders is that the two-spirit people provide balance.
By being able to play both sides. I really like the idea. We need Jeff for the ceremony. Oh, he's out. Okay, well, get Hollee. She's two-spirited. Don't worry about it.
And we have seen two-spirit men step into what may have been a female role. I'm trying to think of an example right now. But yes, I have seen two-spirit men step into what would sometimes largely be a woman's traditional role and responsibility. But again, two-spirit people being fluid between the genders can provide that balance.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very cool thought. I do, this one's for me. Um, as a cis male, so a regular heterosexual gendered male, who is very in touch with his feminine side, loves fancy clothes, and is a single dad, and would I be allowed to step into female roles, or is it very much males do the male thing, females do the female things, two-spirited people do whichever?
You do you.
Okay. No, I love this. You guys have a great society.
You do you. Yeah, the Indigenous people are very, we're not a rigid people.
Yeah.
We're not a rigid people.
Nice. I mean, this sounds great to me. So gender roles in typical Indigenous societies were relatively fluid, and if you were two-spirited, you'd play a bit of both.
Well, certainly traditional gender roles, male-female gender roles existed. However, we're going to engage the people that can do those things, in the absence of. And again, those have been my teachings, is that those two-spirit people being able to be fluid between genders, again, provide that balance and keeps things going in the family, in the community, in so many ways.
Keeps things going how?
Well, two-spirit people are often said to be mediators, people who resolve conflicts, given that wider perspective, being able to understand both male and female perspective, to be able to be adequate, efficient mediators. Certainly when the conflict comes up, to have the people, two-spirit people, move between whatever conflict is going on and to help to resolve it. It just doesn't get stuck in conflict. They're able to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think from my limited knowledge of Indigenous conflict resolution, there are a lot of things that I have heard people in my life go, that would never work, like you're forgiving people, but that actually sound like they really help society move forwards. Do you have any thoughts on the conflict resolution aspect?
I think in our own communities, again, it is, as I said earlier, we had ways and means of dealing with or governing our own families and our own communities, and the use of people who have the gifts and abilities, such as the two-spirit people, to have them come back into that sacred place of care and leadership and healing to the families and the community nation is very important. But also we had a clan system. The clan system was our system of governance. Every clan had a traditional role and responsibility to the family, to the community, to the nation. And so where there was conflict, whatever conflict that would be, those clan members would be called upon to fulfill their traditional role and responsibility, to give perspective, to give teaching, wisdom, and then make a decision collectively as to how to resolve.
Okay. I mean, that sounds really cool. So the different clans, like, I mean, my family in Germany, there were tailors, they made clothes. There were the Schuhmachers, they made shoes. What were the sort of the Indigenous clans like?
So I belong to the Sturgeon clan.
Okay.
And it's an old clan, it's a fish clan. And the teachings that I've had, it's actually an interesting story, if I could tell you the story.
Yeah, please.
So it wasn't until I was about 19 that I came to really want to know and understand who I was as an Indigenous person. And so naturally, I went to the elders that I knew at the time and said, I want to know and understand who I am, where I belong, where I'm from as an Indigenous person. And so there are some very basic but very important identity components, if you will, that are sort of set the stage for coming into the community, coming into the family, traditional roles and responsibilities, and that is through your traditional name and through your clan. And so when I went to the elders and said, I want to know what clan that I belong to.
Yeah.
And so the elders, of course, did ceremony. And it wasn't quite clear to them at the time what clan that I went to. So there was ongoing conversation with other spiritual elders. And so I was really excited. I was really excited to finally know what clan that I belonged to, because again, that sets the stage for where do I belong? What are my roles and responsibilities in life? And so I had thought maybe I was going to be a, bear clan, and I was going to be, one of these big majestic animals. Long story short, I ended up being told I belonged to the sturgeon clan. And I was kind of disappointed, because if you've ever seen a sturgeon, it's not the prettiest fish.
No, they're really
it's not the
long,
prettiest
they're sort of
animal. And I was a bit disappointed. And the elder said to me, Hollee, I want you to go out and study that animal in its natural environment. I want you to research it in any way you can, see that natural animal, and I want you to know and understand that animal. And what you will find is that you will better understand yourself and your traditional roles and responsibilities. And what I come to find out was that the sturgeon clan is a clan of teachers.
Huh.
They have a lot of wisdom. They have a lot of knowledge. They are people that are to bring information to the people, teach people, basically. And it's interesting because I feel like ever since then, I feel like that's all I have been doing, is trying to teach people about, Indigenous people.
Like you're doing now.
Right. But again, that's your traditional role and responsibility. Sturgeon clan is a teaching clan, but with that comes the responsibility of always learning.
Right. Can't be a good teacher if you're not always learning.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. By the way, this sounds like the coolest thing ever. So I thought clan, when I think clan, I think like my Scottish heritage, which is like your family was the Campbells. Bless you. But so it sounds like this is more of a spiritual belonging. It sounds like how do they figure out what clan you're from? What?
And I'm speaking not just from an Indigenous perspective, but from an Ojibwe, which is the clan to which you belong is followed through your father. So my father's family is Sturgeon clan, and there's some exceptions to that. However, it is followed through the father's side of the family, and so there are Sturgeons in my family, right?
Yeah.
And again, in terms of clan membership, so if I meet somebody here in Kitchener that's also a Sturgeon clan member, that person's now my brother or my sister.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's,
But you'd also be related by blood, literally.
Yes, it could be. Maybe. But, I could just be walking in downtown Kitchener, come across another Indigenous person, have a conversation. We kind of identify that we're from the same clan. You're my brother, you're my sister. And that's how we treat each other.
No, that's really neat. That sounds very welcoming and loving. Yeah. Although, to be fair, if I was walking out somewhere and I found someone and they were like, oh, I'm a Stefanescu, I'd be like, oh my God, we should hang out.
Right.
No, that's really neat. I do have a question that I definitely want really your answer specifically on this. So there's a big thing right now in the media about cultural appropriation. As an Indigenous person, what are your thoughts on cultural appropriation and, Canadians trying to, I think Canadians often feel a certain emotional connection to Indigenous heritage as part of a culture that has been blended with our own. Sometimes people want to, engage with that culture, but it's getting hard to navigate because you don't want to appropriate anything, you don't want to offend anyone. What's the right way to move forwards for Canadians with regards to cultural appropriation?
Don't.
Okay, great.
Don't. But understand that, what it is we do, our teachings, our customs, our practices, there is a sacredness to it all. To making those arts and crafts, those paintings, those moccasins, that beadwork, any of those, arts and crafts types things, the music, there's I'm going to drill this, there's a relationship beyond the physical. There's a mental, emotional, and spiritual relationship and a holistic energy that goes into those things that I think settlers don't understand. I can appreciate that you want to know and understand our culture, our way of life, and there's a clear distinction. This is not religion. This is a way of life for us. And I'm happy to share that. But that is ours, and it is sacred. I'm happy to share that. But respect the sacredness of the relationship that we have with these things.
Okay, that makes sense. And you say that that's a way of life, not a religion. Can you talk to that a little?
I feel like religion is something that you do sometimes, or when it's convenient for you, when it benefits you. I'm brown all the time. I'm a traditional Indigenous woman all the time, in the good, bad, and the ugly. I try my best to adhere to the teachings, customs, and practices of my ancestors 24/7.
Yeah.
Certainly, I'm a human being. That doesn't happen all the time. But again, I'm a human being. We make mistakes, and that's okay. But our way of life, again, I got to go back to relationships. Relationships with the land, relationships with people, relationships with places, relationships, like we believe that everything, we have a relationship, and we have everything has a spirit as well. So again, the sacredness of and you're talking about cultural appropriation. I've seen it, in arts. I've seen it in music. I've seen it in a number of different areas, and it's, understand that as our people are, let's say, creating that piece of artwork, or creating that music, there's a sacred relationship and an energy that comes to and from that practice and that custom that is I think, well, it is beyond the understanding of settler people.
Wow. So
it's not just something that we, oh, I think I'm going to paint today. I'm just going to paint this. No, there's a story, there's a relationship, there's a connection, there's a sacredness there.
Wow. It sounds like just a lot of experiences are just very deeply spiritual.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty great. Can I ask you a little bit about the struggle side? As an Indigenous person in Canada, I mean, I've heard things like solastalgia, which, from what I understand, is a loss of a sense of place. Everyone's heard of the residential schools, and there's a lot of material going around about Indigenous people trying to connect with their culture and just the general struggle. Can I hear more about that?
Well, I guess that would mean giving you my personal story to a degree.
If that's okay, I would love that.
Sure, absolutely. So, yes, I'm an Indigenous woman, but I was born and raised off the reserve. Yeah. My parents made a very conscious decision, as I understand, not to raise my brother and I on the reserve, because at the time in the 1970s, it was not a friendly place. It was not a place that they saw would be healthy for us to be raised. And so we were raised off the reserve in the city, and that creates problems. As much as I appreciate that my parents wanted us to have a good life, and they wanted us, as I understand, they wanted us to be able to walk in both worlds. I was very connected to my family. I'm always on the reserve. I'm always with my family, doing things. But at the same time, being raised off the reserve presents a problem. You're an apple. You're red on the outside, white on the inside. I'm a little too brown to fit into white society, but I'm too white to fit into brown society. Right. So I'm sort of in the middle. Where do I fit? Where do I belong? And of course, being a two-spirit person just complicates that even more. So it's been a struggle to know where it is that you belong. And it's true that Indigenous people want to feel safe, and they want to belong in a family, in a community, in that circle of care and nurturing. But it's not always easy for us to find. Even being in the city of Kitchener for a short period of time, I had to seek out other Indigenous people. I had to seek out other people so that I could feel that sense of belonging in a very large and diverse city. So, but it's very true that the sense of belonging is very, very important. And having lived most of my life off the reserve, I still find it difficult to have that sense of place, that sense of belonging.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I often feel invisible
Really?
to my own community. I feel invisible to this community.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Invisible to this community, like, are people racist towards you, or like, tell me more about that. Tell me more about your relationship with this community and what struggles are there.
Well, I'm very new to Kitchener.
Okay.
I'd only just moved here about 3 years ago, really out of necessity. I had actually no plan to live here. I was looking elsewhere and something came up here. So here I am. But
So you moved here for work, basically.
Basically. I do love Kitchener. I love the cultural diversity of it. I've engaged in the Indigenous community, the non-Indigenous community, and it's not the same. It's just not the same. Um, I wouldn't say that I've experienced racism here in Kitchener, because I feel like I just blend in with everybody else.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just I'm dark hair, beige, maybe not brown, but beige.
Yeah.
I just blend into this this place of cultural diversity. And yes, there are things happening in the community that Indigenous people are being visible and vocal, and I'm so grateful for that. But it's we're just getting there, I feel like. Okay. But again, feeling that of not belonging or feeling invisible to my own community is because I don't live there.
Yeah.
My home community is 2.5 hours away from here, and I feel completely disconnected. And I'm disconnected because there's simply no place for me to go at home in my home community. There's no development. There's no land. There's no development. There's no housing. There's no opportunity, economic opportunity, employment opportunity for me to be home with my family. So I need to be out in places like Kitchener to find those opportunities.
That makes sense. So when your parents, you said that your parents didn't want you guys to grow up on reserve and that it was a rough place. Is that why? Because of the lack of financial and economic opportunity?
All of the above. As I understand, this would have been in the 70s. There was a high incidence of alcoholism, violence. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. Of course, we had to go to school off the reserve anyway. So it was just, they thought, my understanding now is that they thought that it would be in our best interests that we be able to function effectively both in Indigenous society and mainstream society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like the reserves are still not a place of great economic opportunities. Has the violence and the alcoholism cleared up a bit? Is that still...
Well, certainly those are still issues in our community. Addiction of all kinds. Violence is certainly an issue. I'm certain you've heard about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and how problematic that has been across our nation. There are some communities that are faring better than others, for sure. I guess it just depends on what community that you're from. I just know from my community, if I wanted to move home, there's nowhere for me to go. So here I am in Kitchener.
That's fair. Mm-hmm. One more question about this. I don't know if it's possible to understand. I don't know if it's possible for me to understand, but the violence and the problems and the alcoholism and the addictions, where is that coming from? What is under all of that?
Trauma. Yeah. And very often you can sort of, very often you connect that trauma to the Indian residential school era. Having lived and worked certainly with Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, I've come to learn that there's always a story behind the behavior. Those people who are living with addictions, mental health, all of these challenges, there's a story behind that. And our story is multi-generational trauma resulting from Indian residential school, resulting from Indian day schools, resulting from hospitals resulting from colonization period.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Colonization really takes its toll, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. That's probably sort of an obvious thing, but I've never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Hollee, thank you very much. That was very, very deeply personal, and I really appreciate that. So with regards to the Canadian political system, such as it is, what do you feel Canada needs to be better for people like yourself, for Indigenous people, for two-spirited people, for humans generally? I mean, what does Canada need to move forwards?
For Indigenous people, they need to really recognize that we are a sovereign nation, that we are a people that knows what it is that is best for us, and we have been the stewards of Mother Earth, the caretakers of Mother Earth forever, and that we do know what it is that is in our best interests. And
so really upping the self-governance and the...
Absolutely. And it's not enough to just, give lip service to us as sovereign people. We do have our own ways of being and doing, and to recognize that, we place so much sacredness, the spiritual aspect of things, the sacredness of our relationships with people, our relationships with land. We get all of those teachings and ways of doing and being from so many different, what's the word I want to use? I'm not even sure what the word is, but anyway, we really need to recognize that Indigenous people are a sovereign nation of people, and we know how to take care of ourselves. So how to reconcile a traditional self-governance, I guess, and reconcile that with mainstream politics. That remains to be seen.
I guess that's the thing. How do we reconcile?
Right. We need to be able to make decisions for ourselves based on the best interests of our, selves, our family. And this is something that you've probably heard me say: self, family, community, and nation. When we say, what we do, we're always self, family, community, and nation collectively. Just like we're always thinking physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual.
Okay.
We're not all about individualism. We're always thinking ahead and for the greater good.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is an accurate blanket statement, but it sounds like you guys have a very altruistic culture of really loving the people you're with, being very spiritual, and being out for community gain as well as living your own truth. That sounds great. Can we adopt that? Can we have this? Because it sounds really good.
Sure you can. Well, we're certainly not a rigid people. We are a very welcoming, friendly people. We certainly want to see everybody succeed, whatever that is for them, but do so in a way that respects each other's individuality, respect people for their beliefs. And it reminds me, some of our treaties historically had said, we want to carry on in this life as brothers in the spirit of cooperation and non-interference. And those things have not been respected, clearly, if you know anything about Indigenous history. We were not opposed to people coming here. It's how is it that we do that in the most respectful way?
I mean, really, yeah. Like in Europe, when one boat came to another land and said, hey, we'd like to live here, they were generally, fighting would happen.
Yeah,
so,
and those treaties were about nation to nation.
Yeah, and you guys don't feel that you've been treated as a nation?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so that makes sense. Indigenous people need to be treated as a nation.
As a sovereign nation.
As a sovereign nation, yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me from your perspective. So current political parties and political climates in Canada, someone who wants to care about, Indigenous people being recognized as a sovereign nation and getting to govern themselves better. Any parties to avoid? Any parties you love? What are the stats? I know you can only say so much because you have a job that is.
I can tell you I vote NDP.
Okay.
That's it.
Boom. Love it. All right. Well, Holly, I have no other questions. Anybody from the crew, anyone else have anything, any funny story that she should share with us? No? No? Okay. That was an aggressive no. Okay. Holly, thank you so much for being on Canadian Love. I really, really appreciate everything that you've told us, and we love you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We love you too.
Oh, thank you. That's good. I feel very good right now. All right,
Excellent.
thank you.
Thank you.
So that was Holly. Big thank you to Holly for coming and joining us. Personally, I didn't know a lot about Indigenous culture, and I mean, frankly, I'm pretty floored. There's a lot that I didn't know and a lot that I still don't know, and it's really fascinating. The whole clan thing, the whole spiritual connection to the land thing. I really enjoyed that. I definitely feel the thought that they are a self-governing nation that has been stripped of the power to govern themselves and need to finally get to take that back, and in a loving way. But they've been very, very loving to what they call the settler people, us, me, I'm white, I guess all non-Indigenous people in Canada. And I think it's time that we show them a little bit of love back after everything that Indigenous people in Canada have been through. Although I did want to say afterwards, I said to her, I said, this is really cool stuff, and there's so much spirituality in the Indigenous culture. Is this something that I'm allowed to learn about? I'm also trying to follow a spiritual journey. And she said, definitely, like, come to our powwows, come to our events, engage with our culture, learn. I mean, you'll never be Indigenous. Oh, fair enough. I guess that makes sense. But we are always willing to share our knowledge. I mean, as we know, she's a Sturgeon clan. She's a teacher, so she was very much about people who want to learn some of the spiritual side of the Indigenous cultural way of life teachings are more than welcome to come and engage with the culture and go to their powwows and events and learn what they can of the spirituality side. I mean, personally, whenever I try to form a spiritual connection with nature and just sit in nature and feel nature for a few minutes, I feel so much better. So this is definitely something I'm going to be investigating. Thank you very much, Holly, for joining us on Canadian Love. Feel free to check out our podcast on the podcast things. Zach, remind me, what are the podcast things? Spotify. iTunes. Google Play. SoundCloud. And SoundCloud. And check us out on Instagram and Facebook. And we want to hear your story. We want to hear your perspective. Please get in touch with us if you want me to ask you about your life and politics. Thanks again for joining us.